Well, welcome everybody. Love to have you joining us here for a Monday Masterclass. And this is going to be a little different. We're not really going to be talking about new product blueprinting per se. We're going to talk about something called design thinking. Maybe you've heard this buzz already. It's not like it's really new. In fact, I think it's been around for, oh gosh, over 30 years. But I'm hearing more and more about design thinking. And so Scott and I said, well, how does blueprinting fit with design thinking? Turns out it fits really, really well. But we're going to cover a few of the finer points of design thinking here so you can see, what it's all about. Now, we've got a white paper on design thinking, but we also have some Blue Help articles. So let's start with Blue Help, because I like to always go here first and see if there's an answer in anything. So I'm going to go ahead and put in design thinking. I can spell that okay. And there we got a little bit on design thinking. So I'm just going to click on this. And by the way, when I click on an article here, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll go to the larger category over here and see where this particular article, number 2, fits. So I'm going to click this. And it looks like we've got 4 articles on design thinking here. So let me start here with this one of blueprinting relative to design thinking. And so I actually, the more I studied this, I realized blueprinting is part of the larger design thinking. It's kind of a specialized B2B version. And what helped me was to process this was think of 3 words that kind of distinguish blueprinting as a special type of design thinking. One word is roadmap, another is front end, and another is B2B. In other words, design thinking is great. It tends to be a fairly broad mindset, which I'll describe in a minute. Blueprinting is a little bit more step by step. We give people, they didn't have to have a design thinking degree from college. We help them with the roadmap. Also, design thinking can go on all the way through prototyping and launch. Blueprinting is really focused on the front end. But then finally, design thinking can apply to anything, building a new housing development. But really, blueprinting is all about B2B, not B2B and B2C, but pretty much B2B. So in some ways, you can think of blueprinting as a fairly narrow focus version of design thinking. And what we're going to do now is we're going to look in the next 3 articles we've got on this. So let me back over to here. That was how blueprinting fits. Now let's talk a little bit more about blueprinting itself and, design thinking itself and see what that's all about, okay? So it really started actually way back in the late 60s. It was discussed as a design as a thought process. But it was in 1987, Peter Rowe put out the book called Design Thinking, and it was used by architects and urban planners and so forth. You might hear it referred to as user-centered design, human-centered design, and you might think, hey, that's what we do with blueprinting. It's all about the users and humans, right? Not about our technology. So anyway, that's how that stacks up. And I'm going to show you this in a little bit more detail when we get into the actual white paper. But it's usually got 5 steps. Empathize. What does that end user want? Define the needs they have. Ideate about solutions. Build a prototype so that users can give you feedback, and test. And what you're going to see in a little bit is blueprinting is a very specialized form of these first 2, okay? So let me go on to the 3rd article, common ground between blueprinting and design thinking. So there's 4 things that blueprinting has in common with design thinking. First one is begin with the end in mind. So this is Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind. And design thinkers, it's not like they're handed a problem. Now go solve this problem. They think about, well, what should this look like when we're all done? What do the users want? Well, that's what we do in blueprinting. What's your job to be done? And what are the outcomes you want to really see improved? So that's in common. The second one is ambiguity is good. Scott and I have noticed if a team is okay with not knowing the answer when they start blueprinting, and they're just open-minded in their interviews, they usually do really well, okay? Some people get really uncomfortable. They want to have the solution already, the answer, and it makes them really nervous until they get the answer. But ambiguity is good for both of these. Now, this next one's key, customer immersion. So design thinking is all about empathetic design. It's watching customers. It's understanding why they want things. Well, hey, that's what we do in blueprinting. We dive deep in interviews and why do you want that? What would that do for you? We do a Muse customer tour methodology, which is kind of like ethnographic research. And then the last one is kind of interesting. We both diverge and converge. Now in blueprinting, we diverge and converge on the outcomes. What are all the outcomes you want? Now let's converge on the ones that are important and not satisfied. And then if you do the latter parts of blueprinting, which is the technical brainstorming, you're going to diverge and converge on the solutions. So you could think of this as a double diamond, right? One diamond for the outcomes, one for the solutions. In fact, it's actually triple diamond because if you start over here in market research, what are all the possible market segments? Let's diverge, let's converge on one of them. So anyway, all that is similar. Well, gee, Dan, if it's all similar, what's different? Well, I'm glad you asked. I think we're going to cover that maybe, I hope, in the next article. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. Differences between blueprinting and design thinking. So here's what's different. Design thinking actually is broader and goes further than blueprinting in several areas. So if you want to go beyond the front end and do prototyping and stuff like that, well, that's really not where blueprinting is going to help you. Yeah, you could do some step 6 technical brainstorming, but we're really just trying to get the outcomes and maybe some technical avenues. But we're about the front end and blueprinting, and design thinking goes beyond it. Because of that, in blueprinting, we don't spend much time talking about prototypes. Usually that happens in the development stage. It could take place in the front end. Some people do prototyping in the front end, but they do it after their interviews are done, and usually after their technical brainstorming. So you're not going to see much in the prototyping with blueprinting. And then we don't get into ethnography per se. Now, ethnography is a study of people's activities. I think it was Margaret Mead who said that, you can try to understand what people say. You can try to understand what people do. You could try to understand what people say they do. And all three of those are very different. And so ethnographers, maybe they can't trust humans and what they say they do, so they watch them and they'll spend a day in the kitchen watching how they prepare meals or something like that. Well, we have a parallel to that, which is our customer tour methodology. But because of B2B, the rationality and objectivity, we can get so much in an interview that you might not be able to get with an end consumer. So yeah, you'll get some ethnography a little bit with our methodology of tours, but not as much here. And this tends to be more appropriate for B2C. So that's where design thinking goes further. And then where does blueprinting go further? Well, we provide a lot more help when it comes to the roadmap. A lot of people who get into design thinking, they maybe have a degree in it, in not maybe design thinking, but in overall design and so forth. And they have this skill, this natural way of doing things. We want this to be every man's design thinking. So whether you're in marketing or sales or you're in R&D, so we provide a little bit more of a roadmap. And you guys know that there's 9 steps that really are all about understanding customers' outcomes. And we lay those out. You don't have to know those because the blueprinting process naturally takes you through those. Also, we're all about skill mastery. If I went to a 4-year course and I graduated and I went to work for IDEO and I'm a designer, I already have these skills. But many of the B2B professionals we work with need to develop them. So we're all about training and really helping them focus on these skills. lots of Blue tools, e-learning, Blueprinter software, Blue Help, and so forth. And then the third thing that's a little bit different about blueprinting, where I would say it goes farther than design thinking, is we optimize it for B2B customers. So it's very respectful, engaging, customers lead this, it's quantitative. If you were with a designer in consumer goods and they were using design thinking, you would notice that the designer is doing a lot more of the work and maybe observing people, a little bit of this, Jane Goodall studying her chimps on the hillside. Well, we're going to actually put our B2B customers to work and treat them with great respect because they're a lot smarter than we are about the things we need to know. So those are 4 articles. Let me just take a breath here. Before I go to the white paper, any questions on any elements of this in the Blue Help section on design thinking versus blueprinting? So far, so good? All right. Well, then let's do this. Let's take a little deeper dive into a white paper we wrote here. I think it was just this year. Let me open this up. Design thinking optimized for B2B. And I won't read this to you guys, but I'll hit a couple of high points. Oh, and by the way, I think you guys know this already, but whenever you want to download any of our papers, just go out to Insights, and we've got ebooks, white papers, and research reports. I'm going to go click on the white papers. And this is out there. We've got one. This is kind of cool on how to commercialize technology. This is the first paper we've ever written that combines blueprinting with Minesweeper. We have another one we wrote this year on B2B versus B2C, 12 differences. Virtual VOC. That was about a year and a half ago we wrote that when the pandemic started. If you ever want to explain market satisfaction gaps to somebody, this is pretty powerful. Innovation metrics, guessing at customer needs. And then I'm getting down here a little bit because this is a little narrower topic, design thinking. So if you want to, just go out to Insights, white papers, and you can download this white paper I'm going to show you. We also have some other ones, the innovation wave, timing is everything. This is about Minesweeper de-risking. And then if you ever get into lean startup and you're wondering about minimum viable product, check that one out, okay? All right, back we go. And we're going to wrap this up with a little quick tour of this fairly new white paper on design thinking. Okay, and so this might be interesting. You might like to know a little bit more about the roots of design thinking, where it all came from. But here's, I think, to me, a really good contrast why design thinking is powerful. So imagine you got a chemical engineering student. I think the only course I ever got a D on was energy transfer. It was awful. So you can see I'm still scarred for life. So I had to put that one in this example here. But imagine somebody actually knew what she was doing and got her chemical engineering degree and was actually allowed to size heat exchangers, okay? Well, that is a well-defined problem. I got this amount of mass, this flow rate, it starts at this temperature, goes to that. That is called a tame problem. It's all well-defined. And if you think about your college years, almost all the problems are tame. Here's a problem, now go solve it, right? Now, imagine an urban designer designing housing for the disenfranchised. They've got to think about affordability, aesthetics, employment, mobility. Oh my goodness. This is what is sometimes called a wicked problem, okay? It is not a well-defined problem at all. And so you can read a little bit more about this. This laureate, Herbert Simon, wrote about this a little bit more. But here's the thing. Design thinking is all about people who have wicked problems that need to solve them. And if you think about it for a little bit, if you are trying to serve the needs of a B2B customer, you don't know what their needs are yet. You've barely been able to define their job to be done, and you have a wicked problem. It's not a well-defined problem at all. Ergo, blueprinting as a subset of design thinking makes a lot of sense. I like this quote a lot. This may just be me, But the author said, if you're an artist or a scientist, you're operating in the world as it exists today. If you are a mathematician, you don't care about time. It's independent of time. But designers are thinking about an imagined future. And I just like that a lot. So if we're doing blueprinting, what are we thinking about? Not a well-defined problem. We're thinking about an imagined future. If you've read Scott's book on Statue in the Stone, on Jobs to be Done, you know, Michelangelo created the statue of David. He took away everything that wasn't, took away all the marble that wasn't David and tried to create perfection. That's what we're doing. We're trying to imagine that. So think about these two ways of solving. As a chemical engineer, you know, for me, my training was all problem-based. And that's great for well-defined problems. I focus on the obstacles. If I'm good at solving problems, that's great. It's linear. It's all about technology. And yeah, engineers like me learn how to do this. Design thinking, better for complex, ill-defined problems. The focus is on the outcomes. Can we be creative? It's not always linear. It's about the user. And this is learned by designers. So in some ways, we're taking, as blueprinting, we're taking a design thinking skill set and applying it to something we never learned in college as engineers or chemists or whatever. So what we're going to do in this article, I'll just hit a few high points. I think this is important. What are the major steps of design thinking? Empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. You can read a little bit more on what these all mean, but I'm going to focus on the first two. Turns out that blueprinting handles the first two steps of design thinking very nicely for B2B. So the empathize is kind of getting into their world, understanding their needs, setting aside our biases, our assumptions, our preconceived notions. We want to start thinking like the user, okay? And I like this. Hey, I never had a chemical engineering exam where thinking like the user was on the test, right? This is challenging, but that's what we're doing here. And I'll give you a clue right now. This is discovery interviews. Empathize, we handle a lot of that in discovery interviews. Now, what's a define step? Here, you take everything you've learned, you gather it together, and you put it in a problem statement. As Kettering once said, a problem well stated is half solved, okay? A lot of companies struggle with this, getting it well stated, but you're going to do preference interviews in the defined state, and you're going to have this market satisfaction gap, which tells you precisely what the market wants you to work on and not work on, and then you from that decide what to work on. So this is where blueprinting comes in, the first two steps. Now, let me just go on a little bit more and then we'll wrap this up. There's some really important benefits of design thinking, whether it's the broader category or it's the narrow blueprinting version. You're going to have stronger value propositions because you started with the customer. You're going to get customer insight really rapidly. If you do the old-fashioned approach, keep lobbing prototypes and samples and products at them until you get it right, it's not so fast. You're going to engage the customer by treating them with respect and asking them what their needs are. If you're doing transformational innovation, this is absolutely the way to go. Step back and get it all right at the very beginning, not trying to just go in a little bit at a time and learning the hard way. Obviously, less squandered R&D if we know what to work on. You're going to handle almost all of your commercial risk in the front end. So now in the development stage, it's really pretty much just about technical risk. And finally, getting rid of the functional silos. Good design thinking gets your marketing, your sales, your technical people out there listening to customers. And that's what we're trying to do. Finally, it changes the culture of your company. Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. As more members of your organization practice a user-centered, user-first mentality, it changes the way we think. Now, the rest of this, I'm going to kind of skip lightly through. There's this B2B paradox I came up with, and that is we face greater challenges, but we also have greater advantages. The challenges are, we don't talk about this a lot. Our markets are confusing. You know, if I want to go into men's dress shirt, dress belts, I know who it is. But gosh, if I'm going to go into a conveyor belting, is it for food? Okay, if it's for food, is it cookies or is it pizzas? Okay, is it in-store baking or factory baking? What about the type of food? What about the size of the oven? I mean, this is not easy to define the market segment. And I don't have one person buying a dress belt. I've got an engineer, I've got a foreman, I've got a purchasing agent. You know, it's complicated. I maybe need to work with the direct customers, but also the people buying the ovens, the baked good producers. There's barriers that purchasing throws up. And then they just may not expect me to be asking them questions. They may be expecting me to sell what I have. So those are the disadvantages. You guys already know the advantages. We talk about this all the time. Knowledge, interest, objectivity, foresight, concentration. Okay, then basically what we're saying here is if you want to optimize the first design thinking step, empathize, blueprinting will do that in the discovery phase. It's the ultimate way of empathizing. And if you look at these dozen tips here, excuse me, sorry, but let me get a drink. Every one of these is designed to improve that engagement. Sticky notes, you're not using hired guns, you're interviewing multiple job functions. I'll let you look at this later. But we didn't come up with a blueprint discovery interview by accident. I mean, it took some trial and error, but it's all designed to help you empathize, enter their world, make them feel good about that, engage them, and so forth. And we find, in fact, our clients report they learn a lot of unexpected information. It's more valuable and a deeper understanding. And then we're also going to optimize a defined step. We're going to get all of these outcomes. Here are some of them you would have for conveyor belting for cooking cookies. And then we're going to go ahead and, of course, do the preference interviews, get the 1 to 10 market importance and satisfaction scores, come up with a market satisfaction, talk about really defining the market needs. That's what we're doing here. So the end of this is, you know, our R&D is really only as good as what we aim it at. And so design thinking and the narrower part of design thinking, blueprinting, is really all about aiming our R&D at what the customers want. So that's the white paper. I'll go back to this section here. And that's all I've got. Any questions? I threw a lot at you pretty quickly. In fact, let me just throw out a question. How many of you have even heard people starting to talk about design thinking? Is that a new phrase for many of you, or are you starting to hear people talking about design thinking? Anybody?
Yes, Beat.
Yes, Beat.
Yes, actually, I experienced design thinking quite, let's say, maybe 20 years ago. And it came up within the financial industries. At UBS at this time, it was maybe 10 years ago. And now I think it's coming up more and more as well in the pharmaceuticals. So for me, it's a little bit a wave on the first hand. And now going all through the different areas. And I think now in pharmaceuticals or healthcare, design thinking is very much en vogue.
Interesting. So you see an uptick in it, but you're also seeing it move almost industry by industry. Is that correct, Beat?
Yes, indeed. Yes. So yes, I got maybe first involved in even in 92, 93 with the famous IDEO video. You remember where they had to put together? I think it was a shopping cart.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes.
Yes, I don't know if you remember that. Yes, they had to put a shopping cart and showed how they did it. And then it was very much kind of in the, let's say, in the machine industry. Okay, it was an upcoming thing. And maybe, as I said, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we had at UBS, we invited IDEO to come and the financial services and do the design thinking work. And in stock companies, yes, it's really a culture change program at the end, kind of, because if you develop a program at financial services, then we use design thinking.
I love it. That's great context for us. And for those of you not familiar, IDEO is how it's spelled, is a design firm out in San Francisco. Tom Kelly And he was one of the first proponents of design. I think he took it from the architectural community and moves it into product development. And so if he has visited a company like UBS and financial services, that's how it's starting to spread. So he must have visited some pharmaceutical companies also, Beat.
And even as I can get late, I'm happy to share with you the latest story. You know that I'm active in the startup environment and
Yes.
in the Basel area for pharmaceuticals. And we did some with a colleague, we did some scenario analysis, thorough analysis. And of course, at the end, it was maybe a little bit boring. But then the guy said, oh, let's do a little bit design thinking instead of, kind of this boring, yes, going forward with the scenarios, and so and this is a person who is 30 years old, and who said, we have to introduce some design thinking.
We'll probably see more of that. Yeah, thank you. That is great background. How about some others? Anybody else run into design thinking so far?
Maybe I can comment. This is Natasha
Yes.
speaking. Coming from 3M and having working for 3M for 24 years, it was the first time that I heard about design thinking in 2017. I have to say that 3M is all its success and 105-year existence depends definitely on innovation, because 30%, 1/3 of its products are new every year. So this is a very big, let's say, stake there with innovation. So traditionally, there is a culture of innovation as well in 3M. I've heard of it. I heard about design thinking for the first time to be incorporated into the innovation process in 2017. And I think that one of the major parts of 3M that it was going to be applied for was definitely when we were working together with customers as a manufacturer, being a manufacturer, let's say, that 3M was, working with very big customers like Boeing or with, who else could it be? Mercedes, because 3M works very much with customers to solve their problems. So there are special teams coming from 3M with a special team from the customer, and they innovate together. So I think that was the first part where I heard about design thinking first, that we are really going to work as a team with the innovation team of the other company, being exactly like Mercedes or OEM manufacturers, in order to solve their problems. And definitely the impact was very big because, for example, 3M, for example, created one screen that could go into Mercedes cars, where in the back seat the kids could watch television on the cushion of their dad's seat. So this was, for example, something that came out of the joint innovation of 3M with Mercedes, for example.
I love it. And, Natasha, 3M has such a history of innovation.
That's an example where I think I saw it more coming. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I benchmarked 3M in mid-1990s, and I asked the guy, what's your secret? He said, we try to figure out what our customers' problems are. So what's fascinating is I think there was a lot of innate design thinking that's been at 3M all these years, but it sounds like they're now bringing in some of these specialized tools and applying it in a very intentional way.
Yes, yes.
Very nice. Thank you.
After 2017, yes. Thank you.
After 2017. So it's really coming on. I know for a while, design for Six Sigma was a big thing. Now looking at design thinking. That's really cool. That's great. Thank you, Natasha. Anybody else have any experience or run into design thinking?
I do feel like I've been seeing and hearing about it more and more recently, although maybe that's because I'm subscribing to your content, Dan, but but I do feel like I'm running across it a little more frequently. And I'm curious, obviously, as you've been laying out here today, design thinking is kind of built into the blueprinting process, but I'm curious if what your thoughts are on some kind of design thinking training, right, for folks in your organization, if that's something that's helpful. I mean, I think even IDEO does some of that. I'm sure there are others out there as well. I'm just curious if you think that that's something that can be very helpful and effective at just continuing to further embed that mindset into the culture of an organization.
I do. I think if somebody said, let's bring in somebody who can teach us some of these concepts on design thinking, I think it would be a wonderful thing for a couple of reasons. The first one is design thinking goes farther than blueprinting. So I think there's a real opportunity to keep that thought process going instead of, oh, great, I got a business case, I got a market case, I'm done. No, no. Let's keep engaging customers and let's keep trying to be in their world. So I would even like to learn more about that. And I don't think we're ever going to go beyond blueprinting, but we might be able to recommend things. So I think that's the first thing. The other reason I like the idea is it just helps with the mindset. I can't tell you how many times we've gone and had a blueprinting course and somebody goes, we just finished a consultative selling course and this really resonates with it. And I'm thinking, that's wonderful. It should, because the best selling is consultative, where we're asking, what's your problem? So I think if somebody takes some broader design thinking, I think the mindset, the culture is going to be very simpatico with blueprinting. The only thing that I have run in a couple times, everybody is busy and it's like, what I'm going to do this. And we've had a couple clients say, shall I do design thinking or do blueprinting? And that's what caused me to write the white paper. I said, no, guys, blueprinting kind of is, within that whole design thinking. Now, if it doesn't work for you, then don't use it. But instead of an either or, let's try to do an and approach. Does that make sense, Meredith?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so.
We ran into something like this with lean thinking. That's another one. I don't think, lean startup. I don't know if that's maybe crested a little bit, but for a while, lean startup was a really big thing. So we wrote a white paper on that. And that again has some really valuable things. Now, again, if we don't think it through carefully, we had a huge client just went way into lean startup, and they just went out and started throwing minimum viable products at their clients. And, it turned out this particular client made aircraft engines of ours. And they said, turns out, Airbus and Boeing aren't interested in minimum viable aircraft engines, And his point was, if we can have an intelligent conversation with somebody, lean startup has a build, measure, learn step. And we said, keep the build, measure, learn, just put a learn in front of it and have it start with an intelligent conversation. So I think the key is, don't take anything new out of the box and say, I'm going to apply it. Apply the B2B versus B2C filter, think about it a little bit, but so far, all of them have something of value. And I think design thinking has a lot of value, actually.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Meredith. Good thoughts. Yeah.
Hey, this is Nelson. I've got an oddly appropriate one. The company I just came from was trying to solve a problem in the food industry in conveyors, oddly enough.
That's great.
Yeah, it was actually there's a specific conveyor called a breader belt that's used in breading typically chicken and other food, and they beat the crud out of them. They typically only last for a matter of weeks, and it took a couple of years. It was an interesting process. They partnered with the biggest chicken manufacturer out there, I think the second biggest, and ended up with a belt that was, when I left the company, they'd been testing it successfully for almost a year. It was an interesting process to watch them go through. I caught it at the tail end though, but they spent an awful lot of time with the customer trying to figure out exactly what would make this belt appropriate.
What a great example. I love that. Nelson, I got to tell you, I usually try to come up with examples that are not from one of our clients because I don't want them thinking that we took them. And so far, but what happens is I came up with paint, then we had a paint customer. I came up with forklift, then we had a forklift customer. Came up with nail guns. I actually got in trouble this one. The client says, you have an example on nail guns. You know, you shouldn't be telling people about nail guns. I said, guys, I wrote this like 5 years before you were a customer. And then they came back and said, well, could you at least put our nail guns in the picture? So I haven't had the food belt yet, Nelson, but I
was 3 years in the food belt industry, oddly enough.
That is great. Well, I'm glad. It sounds like it's a tricky one. It sounds like it's a wicked problem. So thanks.
Well, it was a huge problem. It's one thing about the food industry is you hit the average food belt guy. I wasn't in there long enough, but they become experts in pretty much every element of every food because they don't segment. The food industry as a whole supplies to the entire industry.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I know people that are experts in from baking to he just got excited because he told me a couple of weeks ago he learned all about the cranberry harvesting industry, and it's just they have to know everything. It's impressive.
Every new project's a learning experience if you're in the food belt industry. I didn't know that. Thanks, Nelson. Great example. Well, anything else? Anybody else have anything on this? And what we'll do, if you have any, let's do this. If you've got anything else on design thinking, please bring it up. If you've got anything in general that you'd like to talk about, please bring it up. And if you have nothing, we'll say so long, but I'll be quiet for a few seconds as you think about that.
Yeah, this is Nelson again. I am dealing with an interesting problem. I've gone through the discovery phase. We went to the preference phase. I'm about 10 interviews in, and the problem I'm coming up with is the satisfaction gaps are tiny. I mean, we know our customers like our product, but it's been really hard. The biggest gap we found is about 28%, and it drops off from there very quickly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, let's take a look at that. So let's just go out here real quickly. We'll go out to here and just jump into the Blueprinter software, just so everybody is kind of thinking about the same thing you're thinking about. We get down the analysis here, and then we got the market satisfaction gaps here. So the first thing I like to ask, do you remember offhand, Nelson? You don't have to answer all these if you don't want, but what I like to do is I like to look at this chart first to see if I have big standard deviations. Do you remember if this was fairly tight on that chart?
There were 2 or 3 that were fairly, most of them were tight.
Okay. Okay, that's good. That's good because for everybody's benefit here, it's often the case where if you have some broad standard deviations, you're averaging out a whole bunch of needs. Now, this one looks pretty high, okay? But then if you look at these narrower segments by region or by point in the value chain, what often will happen then is as you get a more narrow focus, you get, in fact, this actually shows up here, you'll get higher gaps. So the first thing I like to do is check to see, do I have fairly tight standard deviations? And if the answer is yes, then I start asking myself some more questions. Another question is, did I interview, enough people, the right people in the market segment, and to get a fairly representative sampling? Do you feel like you were able to get the companies you wanted to interview that represent the market segment fairly good, Nelson?
Generally, yes.
Okay.
The deviations, like for example, one of the deviations I attributed very much to customer size, and another deviation was very clear that at one, it was related to one specific instrument that they used, and there was a very low satisfaction if they used the instrument, a very high satisfaction if they didn't use the instrument. So I was able to tie it in very closely. It's just that it was kind of I can't figure out where they're truly unhappy.
Yeah, because whether they use the instrument or not, were you getting still a low market satisfaction gap?
Where they were, well, it was an issue of fit in our equipment, and this particular piece of equipment is a very tough fit. So if they used that equipment, their satisfaction was low because they couldn't figure out how to get it in our equipment, and if they didn't, then it was very high because they just didn't really see that problem.
Okay, so there may be a little bit of a sub-market segment for people who weren't using it that you could maybe pursue that, perhaps. Is that right?
Possibly. But it's a fairly commonly used piece of equipment. It's not, it hasn't been a, it polarized it just on that one point. And I haven't
Just
been
that
able,
one point.
yeah, I
Yeah.
couldn't come up with another point where it caused any shift.
So not a lot to sink your teeth into. So the
No,
second,
not yet.
okay, so then the next things I look at are, did I get to the right job functions? And did I get to the right point in the value chain? Now, if you're making let's talk about the value chain first. If you're making a material or a component that ends up inside your customer's product, then you usually have to go down the value chain. So if I'm making, you know, an ingredient that goes into paint, I may want to talk to not just the paint producer, but the people who actually do the painting, right? But if I make a piece of equipment or I'm doing a service, oftentimes I'm only interested in the customer's process, not their product. So if you're making a piece of equipment, oftentimes it doesn't go into your customer's product, they just use it. So in that case, you probably don't need to go down the value chain. Is that fair in your case, would you say?
That is correct. And what the nice thing is that I interviewed generally managers, and the thing about our industry is those managers used to be users of our equipment. Generally, they get promoted from within. So they're very hands-on.
So that answers the last question, which is, you know, did you get the right job functions? Because sometimes if managers weren't in that lower level, they go, oh, everything's fine. And you talk to the operator on the floor in the lab and go, oh, it's awful. But you sound like you've solved that issue. So
Generally, from what I've talked, yeah, the people I've talked to were promoted from positions where they use it.
yeah, so it sounds to me like you might be very close to an overserved market. Because in our research, we find about 5% of markets are overserved. Now, I usually say if you've got a gap of around 30% or more. So I think your 28% is certainly worth pursuing.
Yeah, for one of them, absolutely.
For one of those, I would definitely go after that. Were the rest of them like down in the low 20s and below then?
A couple, yeah, there was, I think I had 2 or 3 that were 22 or 23, and then it dropped off to 16, and there was, the lowest was like 6.
So what I would probably do is I'd see if we can come up with something on that one that had the outcome had 28%. And then if, without adding cost or significant effort, if I can get something in the low 20s, if I can improve that a little bit, I'd go after that as well. But that's probably what I would be pursuing on this thing. And if I couldn't see a good path on that 28% outcome, I'd probably say, you know, guys, let's turn our guns on something else that there's some high market satisfaction gaps. Because this, and then make sure you celebrate that if you end up doing that, because most people think, oh, that didn't work out. And no. If there's nothing for you to sink your teeth into, think of all the development time you save by not pursuing it, right?
Yep.
Great.
Good. Thank you.
Good.
I appreciate it.
Wonderful, wonderful example to share with us. Thank you for that, Nelson. Anybody else have one you'd like to bring up? All right. Well, you guys look like you're eager to get after your Mondays. Aren't we all, right? So we'll say so long for, I know, Scott, I always forget this. Let's go back and see what we got coming up. I feel like it's always a little bit of a surprise because I didn't do my homework. Let's look at the Monday master classes. You probably remember, Scott, I do not. It looks like the next one is, so you've got a new product idea. So I think, Scott, you're going to be helping with this one a little bit. Do you want to mention a couple things on this?
You bet. You know, it's just so very common that, well, it's funny. We just had a conversation with the client just this morning with like, well, we sure wish we would do blueprinting prior to our stage gate. However, in real life, it's just so common that we actually do have a product idea, maybe a prototype, something we've been working on. It's just such a common situation that I thought it'd be worthwhile to take one of our master classes and talk about. Can you still do blueprinting? Yes, you can. But there might be a few things you would do differently with the product idea in mind. And that's what we'll chat about here in a couple of weeks.
I'm glad you put this one up there because we've often talked about these when we're asked, but we haven't really put in a master class. And there's several things we can talk about. I can picture it now, Scott. So count on me being there, okay?
Okay.
All right. Hey, well, thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your Monday, and we'll see you at a future Monday masterclass. In the meantime, if you have questions, you know where we live. Thanks now.
Have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.